All right, we are live. Alec Zeck, welcome back to the Terrain Theory Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a good podcast, and I'm happy to be here.
Happy to have you back on, and we appreciate you taking the time. We know you're a busy man working on the end of COVID. We're going to chat about that a little bit. Before we do, let's imagine a listener is ready to discover true health and healing. Where should they start?
Because it's fresh on my mind, in order to begin to understand what true health and healing looks like, first off, I don't claim to be an expert on that. Like, I don't claim to be the healthiest human being, but I'm striving for perfect health, right? But in order to begin down the path of true health and healing, I think the most important part is dissolving all of the untruths with respect to health. And what I've found is that as you continue to chip away at all of the untruths, health really becomes very, very simple for the most part. The only complicated part of health is all of the mistakes that we've made because of we bought into those untruths. And that is the complicated and very time consuming, very difficult task is resolving all those issues that occurred because you believed those untruths with respect to health. So, looking in the right direction, shameless plug, the end of COVID, the first, the end of COVID, the name is really is incorrect, but it's incorrect intentionally. Um, you could call it the end of all pandemics. You could call it. I was just on with Don Lester and David Parker. We're finishing up our final few recordings for it, and David said this is just the end of allopathic medicine because we're covering so much more than just what happened the last 3 years. Excuse me. We're covering everything, like everything. Uh, Obviously, not going into topics like cancer and things like that, but at the least touching on them. But with respect to so-called infectious diseases, we're going into everything. I don't think there is one thing that we don't cover, and it's an extensive, thorough uh, dismantling of all the untruths with respect to so-called infectious diseases and the pandemic industrial complex that underpins much of allopathic medicine.
I love that. I think that echoes what Tom Cowan said on a recent appearance on this show, and that was to get to truth, he just figures out what isn't true. That and this is what you guys are doing. This is what you're doing with the end of COVID. And I've heard some folks say, this is past us. Why is it still coming up? But the truth is that it's not. That
Mm-hmm.
we may have been told that COVID is over, but the illusions that allowed for COVID to happen are still very much in place. And so I find that this project that you're taking on, you and all the others in this space, is 100% essential. And I think that the timing is perfect because we are at risk of already forgetting everything that we've been through and then putting ourselves at risk of going through it again.
You couldn't have said it better. I mean, at one point in time, the people who were in the midst of the Spanish flu towards the tail end of it said, oh, it's finally over. And then later on, when people were in the midst of polio, they were like, oh, it's finally over at some point. And then HIV/AIDS, and then the bird flu, and then SARS-1. This story has been repeated over and over again in virtually all of history, but especially in modern history, especially with the within the Rockefeller medical paradigm. And this story needs to end. It's a story that will continue unless we understand what allows stories like this to continue taking place. And the reality is, we have the power to ensure this nonsense doesn't happen. And that power has to come with knowledge. That's how the power comes about. You have to know. And I'm not talking about scratching the surface and finding out that, oh, COVID wasn't as deadly as we thought it was, or scratching the surface and saying, yeah, they made a bioweapon, but this one wasn't as deadly, but the next one's going to be super deadly. And Bill Gates is talking about 2025. So we need to be aware. We need to be prepared because they're going to come up with a new bioweapon. No, that's not getting to the root of it. It's so much deeper than that. And of course, the overwhelming majority of your audience already knows that because you feature a lot of the depth surrounding this topic. But that's the point. And especially right now when the majority of the medical freedom slash truth or whatever community is latching on to this nonsensical gain of function narrative as the book is closing on COVID. And that actually creates a scenario that allows the germ nonsense to perpetuate into the future, but also with much scarier or seemingly scarier future implications. And as the mainstream position has become so unbelievably ridiculous that, you know, people are jumping ship en masse because it's becoming so ridiculous. And I think that's intentional. And now they're latching on to the words of these alternative talking heads who are shouting from the rooftops, gain of function. We need to prosecute Fauci. Fauci's just going to be the fall guy. And I don't disagree with the idea that Fauci has committed major crimes against humanity, but he's just the figurehead. There's so much more, and it's the whole system that needs uprooting, and that's what we explore during the end of COVID.
I can't wait. I think you started to answer this next question, but I'd love for you to go a little bit deeper. I've noticed that you're leaning away. You have been leaning away from the phrase like health freedom and medical freedom. And why is that? Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, this is such a good question. Do I believe in health freedom? Yeah, absolutely. Do I believe in medical freedom? Absolutely. But the health freedom movement and the medical freedom, the movement that is health slash medical freedom, has become a toxic quagmire of people who are in a perpetual victim mentality. And I want to be clear here. These people have been victimized. A lot of these people are vaccine injured, or their parents of vaccine injured people, or they just woke up to some harm that was committed to them with respect to cancer treatment, something, right? Like the overwhelming majority of these people have been victimized. But it's just a toxic quagmire of people constantly pointing a finger at the system saying, you have power of me and I don't like it. You have power over me and I don't like the way that you have power over me. I don't like the form. I don't like the shape. And it's just constant focus on that, absent of adopting an understanding of what health really looks like at a deep level. And that requires that you dissolve the victim mentality that is perpetuating in the health slash medical freedom movement. And then in addition to that, I think it's no secret now I'm a voluntaryist. So I reject the notion that we need a centralized authority in our lives. And the overwhelming majority of people in the medical freedom movement are focused on legislation, are focused on just getting the right guy in office, are focused on just slightly altering the system a little bit. If we just get a new director at the NIH that's not Fauci, well, everything's going to be so much better. If we just get this president or this guy elected as president, then all this is going to turn around. And I don't deny the reality that things would be um, better if those people were put into office, but it still allows the system as it is to prevail. And the system itself is the problem. And in addition to that, a layer deeper is that these people are all looking at these authority figures as legitimate from the health slash medical freedom lens. And none of this nonsense would have happened over the last 3 years if people were properly educated on all that we're sharing during the end of COVID, but also if people were properly educated on the illusion of authority. And that's also something that we go into in a very deep way during the end of COVID. We've partnered with Greg, Paul, John Little, and the Sovereign's Way, who've created the course Law for Mankind, and there will be a mini lesson at the start of each module for the end of COVID discussing things like what is a right, what are men and women, what is the government, what is your relationship to it, going into details to help people understand. By the end, they'll know that none of this could have happened if they just knew who they were and they knew their relationship to these men and women that are acting as agents of the states, and they knew that the only way this nonsense continues is because we believe they have legitimate authority over us. Uh, and some people may listen to that and say, well, I don't believe it. And I'm like, yeah, but are you still acting in ways in accordance with the idea that they have legitimate power? Maybe you don't like it, but there's a difference between not liking it and literally not recognizing them as a legitimate authority in your life. And there's a huge distinction there, but it's subtle.
So what's just happened now is that there's been a little snowball, and you went from the end of the allopathic model, the end of that system, to now the end of a political system that not only is this one thing corrupt, but also this other thing is corrupt. And I imagine that to a listener, there is almost like a cognitive dissonance, a reflex to reject such a position because it's overwhelming. And that when a person who has existed in this system that may be authoritarian and uh, may strip you of your rights also does seem to provide some safety or the appearance of safety and comfort. And so I would imagine that to a listener, some listeners, what you're describing, the images might be of just all of a sudden people looting, it's anarchy, like people looting,
Yeah.
no one following the speed limit. How do you disabuse the listener of that perception?
Yeah, this is such a good question. Do I acknowledge that the state, the government, uh, carries out acts and um, implements things that are beneficial to society at large? Absolutely, absolutely, it does. It serves necessary functions, but in addition to those few necessary functions that it serves, it also serves to coerce, manipulate, extort, and wield its power against us in a way that they are um, essentially doing exactly what gangs do, except for the differences we believe they have the moral justification to do so.
Mm.
So when people bring this up, and we discussed this during the end of COVID with a session with Mark Gober and Etienne de la Boche, the authors of two books on voluntarism, is that every function that the state currently occupies could be done in the private. And as an example, a police force. The state's police force has little incentive to do really well with policing because there's no competition, and if they f up, they're still in a position of authority, and there's ways that they can get around it. There's of course corruption that is rampant amongst police forces, and I do acknowledge that to a large degree, police serve an important function of protecting people and ensuring that men and women don't infringe or impose upon the rights of other men and women. But again, that could be done in the private. And what that might look like is in a local town, you have competing security forces. Maybe I'm maybe I own a freaking bazooka and a bunch of hand grenades and a bunch of rifles. And I'm like, I don't need to pay for that. I don't feel the need for security because I feel secure in and of myself. I can defend myself. So I'm not going to pay for that. Whereas right now, what we have is you're extorted, you are forced to pay for security that you may not even want, that is may not even be good, and all these other things that we're extorted to pay for through taxation. Um, but if maybe I am someone who wants policing in my area, maybe there is some neighbors that I'm sketched out by because they're constantly looking around people's property. So I come together with a few of my other neighbors and I say, hey, would you want to go in on uh, this privatized police over here, and we'll all pitch in a little bit of money for them to patrol our area once or twice a week? Yeah, we could do that. Okay, we'll pitch in some money for that. And then that police force itself has an incentive to do well because there's other police forces in the area that if that specific privatized police force doesn't do well, if they're known to accidentally kill people, if they're known to not actually secure people's rights and property, then they're not going to have business. And then they have a huge incentive to do better. And that's what it might look like in a voluntarist society.
Let's keep going down this road, because a lot of what you're now talking about are some of the like mission statements, shall we say, of the way forward. And one of my questions I wanted to ask you was, if you could snap your fingers and make the world align with the vision of the way forward, what would that look like? You've just talked a little bit about like sort of private industry, free market. How would groups organize? Like how would people self-govern? What would the economic system look like? How is conflict resolved internally and externally? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So I don't pretend to know the exact um, solution to everything. First off, I'll say that. And that's why with our mission statement, we say we're charting the path
Love it.
towards health, freedom, and awareness for all of mankind, because we don't know the path, but we're beginning to chart the path. And that's what we're exploring, all these topics for a better way forward for mankind. But the first thing to understand is that the way a voluntarist society would operate is a way in which every interaction between any man, woman, organization, or entity requires the voluntary mutual consent of all parties involved. No coercion, no force, no threats, et cetera, et cetera. And so, with that, men and women can form agreements together in a local area. They can say, hey, do you guys all agree that us in this area we're going to resolve disputes in this manner? Yes, okay. And then there also could be private court systems and things like this, right? But if I don't agree with how that local area is resolving disputes, as an example, I don't have to participate in it. So long as I am not imposing my will or infringing upon others, I don't have to participate in any of those things, and I can go somewhere else. What we have right now, if people say, if you don't like America, then get the hell out. And it's like, okay, I'll just go to another country where I'm subjected to another authoritarian force. It's not true voluntarism in any capacity, right? And with respect to how businesses might look in that society, I think capitalism, especially for people who are traditionally liberal, and I say traditionally liberal, not leftist, a lot of traditionally liberal people still look at capitalism as something bad. Capitalism is something that is really good, but we've never seen a true free market with capitalism, right? We've only seen a regulated market that operates under the guise, kind of like the name of, oh, we have a free market in the United States. No, we don't. We have a market that is manipulated by the companies who want their interests pushed to the front, and then they lobby in Congress to get legislation to pass that benefits them at the expense of other companies who are smaller, and also at the expense of the people, et cetera, et cetera. In a truly free market, though, when you have the choice, you have the ability to choose, all of these companies would be forced to do their best to ensure they have the best product, good, or service. Because if they don't, people simply stop buying it, and there's no coercion, force, manipulation surrounded with that. And do I pretend that in a voluntary society, everything, we would be totally free of corruption? We would totally be free of people infringing and imposing upon each other, of murder, death, rape, all these things? Absolutely not. We would not be free of it. But I argue that there would be a lot less of it, because in a society like this, I argue that the largest perpetrator of all of those things that I just named is the state itself.
Mm,
Oddly enough, under the guise of protecting those rights of other people,
mm,
it then does all of these things. It extorts people, it murders people, it violently wields its power against people, it coerces people, manipulates people into obedience and compliance, oftentimes with things that have nothing whatsoever to do with morality. They're just a law, code, act, or statute that was passed to benefit some private interest or corporations. And I think that if we are free of that centralized authority, there will be much less of it. And then another point, final point that I'd like to make on this is that I think government itself breeds immorality. And what I mean by that is when you're constantly looking up to mommy and daddy government for the answers on things, you are not wrestling with your own moral position. Or maybe if you do realize that you have a moral position, of which many people don't even realize they should, you're conflating your own moral position with what mommy and daddy government say. So, what that looks like is that if it's a law, code, act, or statute, it's moral. If it's not a law, code, act, or statute, it's immoral. And then what we when we see that in application, that's COVID. That's literally what happened. That's why so many people were like, "Oh, the government says to do this, therefore that's the moral position. Therefore that's what I'm going to do. Therefore anyone who doesn't do it is automatically immoral." And so when we don't have the state's involvement anymore, we're then forced to wrestle with our own moral position and look at, wow, what do I actually believe in? What do I think is the right thing to do? And if at the least we can all agree on, I will never impose or infringe upon someone else, minimize force, maximize consent in every situation, that's a really good starting point. But we're not even close to being there right now with what we have with this current system of governance. And then in addition to that, people will talk about the need to fight for democracy, or they'll say, well, we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. Regardless of whether we're supposed to be a democracy or constitutional republic, which I agree a constitutional republic would be better, it's still the idea that the majority's perspective is then wielded upon the minority and the majority violently with a threat of force and coercion and the use of force for those who don't comply with it. So, what happens when the majority's perspective is completely off? It's still then pushed upon the entirety of society as the prevailing consensus, dare I say, position on a topic. And again, that's you. The state is the mechanism by which that is pushed on society. So if the state is no longer there, we'll be forced to look at our own moral positions. And I would argue that would breed a more morally sound society. And the last thing I'll say on that, an analogy, is it's akin to as a parent saying, yelling at your kids and saying no because I said so, versus saying no, we probably don't want to do that. Maybe using the Socratic method, question asking to get your child to wrestle with the implications of what they're doing. That is the voluntarist way versus the statism way, is just saying no because I said so.
Uh, do we have eh, on the world today or in the recent past examples of voluntarist societies that have existed successfully?
The Kogi people in Colombia is the first example that comes to the top of my mind. Yeah, absolutely, we do. Where they have elders in their community who sort of guide people, but they're not forcing or coercing anyone. I'm not saying that this type of society would be absent of governance. It would just be absent of government.
Mm.
It wouldn't be absent of leaders who are, thought leaders who are encouraging people into behaving certain ways that are hopefully moral positions. It would just be absent of coercion or force, or at least coercion or force would be minimized.
And I want to go back to something that you said about how we don't live in like a true capitalist or free market society here in the United States. And I think for the listener, you have no better example than what happened during COVID. And you had small businesses everywhere shut down,
Yeah,
but who remained open? Some of the like big box stores and some of these big corporations
absolutely.
because they lobbied and were allowed to. So, in the face of all the quote unquote science we were given, they rose to the top and had the special exception. So it's not a level playing field, clearly.
No, not even close.
Yeah. Mike and I talk often about, and we draw our inspiration from the author Daniel Quinn, but building parallel structures, looking at our current civilizational system as somewhat broken, and all of us sort of being prisoners in this civilizational system without even knowing where the bars of the cage are. We talk about walking away from the pyramids, basically simply turning our back on this broken modern civilization and creating the better one, which is what the way forward seems to be doing as well. this assumes that the broken, or maybe it doesn't assume, but it seems to assume that the broken modern civilization and those who control it, those power brokers, would allow that parallel structure to be built. And in a world where might makes right, like how can such a goal truly be achieved without conflict?
Yeah, this is a good question, and again, I won't pretend to know the answer, but this kind of relates, and I think you'll see how I tie this together with a conversation I had with a friend of mine a few months ago with respect to voluntarism and what we saw with COVID, right? And he brought up, well, dude, there were people in Australia that were standing up to this, and they were just fucking thrown around.
Yeah.
Like, what do you say to that? And I thought about it for a second. And I'm like, damn, that's a good point. Really good point. But the difference is Australia, for the most, well, no, in reality, has already succumbed to a certain level of belief in the illusion of authority past where we are currently at in the United States that is going to make it harder for them to go back the other way. Kind of like the example I brought up with respect to health earlier. When you've fallen for these illusions, they compound and build up. And the root is very simple, but to get back to the root, you have to dissolve all of these untruths. And that is an arduous task that is very time consuming and painful and complicated. So in Australia, as an example, they had already believed that the authority had the right to take their guns.
Mm.
So they all gave back all of their guns. They've already gone down the line of government tyranny and authoritarianism to a degree that makes it difficult for them to traverse back the other way.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, we haven't done that for the most part. Some states have. And the states that did, how much more difficult was it to exist and to exert and express your rights as a man or woman in those states? Much more difficult. Yeah. So in I think you see how that kind of relates to your question. What would it look like? Would it be without conflict? And I don't know if it would be without conflict. I think transitioning to a voluntary society is going to have to be done on the local level. So Etienne de la Boche talks about during the end of COVID, New Hampshire. There's like a mass exodus. It's called Free State Project of people moving to New Hampshire that are liberty mind, like libertarian leaning at the least, like liberty minded people moving to New Hampshire. And I think projects like that, and of course you could say people moving to Texas or Florida, which tend to be more conservative people, which is just the flip side of the coin. But that's a story for another time. But at the least, somewhat freedom oriented. Even though it's a convoluted version of freedom, at least somewhat freedom oriented people are moving to these states where they want liberty. And I think it'll have to be done on the local level. And I think the transition to voluntarism is going to be a difficult task because even though we're not Australia, we've still succumbed to this belief in authority so much that it's going to take some work to dissolve all of that conditioning and undo all of these things. And building parallel structures, do I think that they're going to try to stop us from doing that? Yes, they will coerce us, manipulate us, threaten us, scare us in every which way possible because they want power over us. But just like what happened with the last 3 years, they manipulate us into giving our own consent. That's it. If all the people who saw what happened the last 3 years and beyond and did not like it at some level, did not authentically want to comply at some level, simply just acted authentically, which doesn't require belligerence, hostility, doesn't require imposing or infringing upon others. It requires just being a free man or woman that is loving and kind and is choosing to live authentically. None of this would have happened. It happened because we consented to it, or if we, didn't consent as much as others, we still believed the government was a legitimate authority. There's so many of us, especially in the health freedom space, there's like, I didn't comply with any of this. You still believe the government is a legitimate authority, which is still perpetuating the illusion of authority, which still perpetuates what they do. So I think, I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think it at least kind of did.
Yeah, well, I think it's a road that as a thought experiment just can get messy. When
Hmm.
you start to think about um, what those power brokers will do to hang on to their power, and really, if you are
Yeah.
talking about building a parallel structure, the what is necessary are resources, land,
Yeah.
land, water, food, access to
Yeah.
that. So you start to take that resource away from those who currently control things, and they don't like it. So what will they do in return? But also what you're talking about is, and I like this aspect of the thought experiment, is if everybody, think about that, if everybody who didn't agree just sort of stood up and said, we don't agree, and also we don't acknowledge your authority, that's a numbers game. And that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people who are quote unquote currently ruled, saying, not only do we not agree with what you're saying, we no longer acknowledge your authority. And you win. You win just like that, like snap of a finger.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, and that's why I really enjoy the conversations that you're having, the interviews that you have on your podcast, and also what you're doing with the way forward is it's planting these seeds so that we can get to that point where enough, it's just critical mass, isn't it? It's just arriving at critical mass. um, and I almost feel, again, back to that thought experiment, you could almost imagine like a light switch going off, like hitting that critical mass, and then all of a sudden everything just flips and poof, like you're in this like beautiful new world. And it is just almost as simple as a belief system. Like, I'm just going to rewire right now. You have no authority over me. Boom, my life is now changed. There's like the before and now the after, and I'm never going back. And boom, it's the new frontier.
I
So
think so, especially because like we have to remember that I used to be in the government. I was a captain in the army, right? I was just a man, but I was a man who, for the initial part of my army career, had fallen for all of these illusory beliefs, and I think that these ideas and this education is helpful in that it also takes those who are acting as agents of the system and can help them reframe, because I think a lot of us in the truther community tend to fall for this idea that all of them are in on it. Like all the agents of the state are all in on this grand scheme.
yeah.
But we forget about things like the Milgram experiments, the Ash experiments, the Stanford prison experiments, which studied groupthink, authority, and the wielding of power, and then also obedience to authority between those three experiments. And all those things sort of describe what happens with the human condition, and especially with government, where you have a group, you have a hierarchical structure, and you have authority. All those things create a situation where well intentioned, good people are manipulated into doing very bad things for what they think are virtuous, you know, reasons. And I think if we continue to educate people properly, we can turn this around pretty quickly. And again, I think the transition could get very messy, but again, that flip of the switch, just like you're describing, if we all did that, and that included people who are acting as agents of the states or agents of the state, I think that it wouldn't be that messy. I really don't think it'd be that messy. I uh, I read my son at night books by the Tuttle twins, and I don't agree with everything that they say, but they have some really good stuff. And in one of their books, it's called The Law. They talk about at the end how the left versus right system perpetuates plunder, which I completely agree with. And they're talking about, or they sort of ask this guy in the book, these little kids ask this guy, well, how do we fight back? Like, how do we turn this around? Because they kind of get angry as this guy is describing what happens in the nature of the left versus right paradigm in government. And he grabs a book off his shelf and he says this, and he says, the sharing of true ideas, the sharing of principles like this, and spreading this understanding amongst people is what helps turn this around.
Mm.
And I couldn't agree more, because again, like, coming back to it with respect to freedom, it's also so simple. At the root, it just requires that you understand that these people in government are just men and women like you. That's it. You are also a man. You're also a woman. And if you stop believing that they have legitimate power over you, their power ceases to exist. Is it harder when it's one individual man or woman doing that by themselves? Absolutely. But when we do it in mass, I would argue even like 3 to 5 to 10%, absolutely we can turn this around. And again, it doesn't require belligerence, hostility, it doesn't require you standing outside your courthouse rallying, it doesn't require any of that nonsense. It requires you simply just stop believing they have the power to tell you what to do.
I love it. Mike, jump in here.
You know, gentlemen, I don't need to talk just to hear myself talk. I have such high uh, admiration for both of you, Alec and Ben. So, as you were, gentlemen. Seriously, Alec, your podcast is a go to for me. It's one of my favorites. You know, there's like
Appreciate that, man.
5 to 10 that I sort of cycle through, but I'm always coming back to you consistently. As for the listener, make sure to make the way forward part of your listening routine as well. And we get, Ben and I have been on this journey for whatever it's been, a year and a half, 2 years, and there's this accelerated education that's occurring, and it's a beautiful thing to witness it with you, Alec, because I think you would probably say the same thing when you think about where
100%.
where you were at a year ago, 2 years ago, um, and where you are now. Um, it's beautiful to behold and to sort of like be on this journey. Ben and I always are talking, especially amongst ourselves, that being on this journey together. But I very much feel like I'm on it with you, Alec, even though we've never met in person. And I just want to say thank you for having the bravery and the like intellectual curiosity and tenacity to keep moving forward and to keep turning over the next stone, because I think that this is the only way that we do move forward is by having conversations, by turning over stones, and as Daniel Quinn says, who we're always referring to, you just have to sort of turn people on one mind at a time. That's the only
Yeah.
way it's ever that true information ever sort of um, you know moves and
Mm-hmm.
spreads and is embraced. So you've been a huge part of this this movement. So thank you for everything you do.
Yeah, thank you. It means a lot. And the podcast that you guys have is freaking fantastic. So that means a lot coming from both of you. But yeah, we're all on this journey of unbecoming together.
Yeah.
Like that's what's taking place right now. We're undoing all that conditioning that I've talked about during this episode. We're just all doing it together. And it's like, I don't know what it is about us, but I love having my paradigm flipped upside down and questioning things that I was once taught to believe in.
Yeah.
And that's what's so funny about this is like people will say when it comes to terrain or when it comes to government, et cetera, is that I'm just confirming my bias. I'm like, you wouldn't be saying that if you knew what I believed in 2 years ago, because I
know.
believed for the most part what you believed probably.
I
And
know.
then it required me to look at it and say, well, is that actually true? I don't know. Let's go look and be willing to face the cognitive dissonance. Like you're talking to someone who went to West Point and was an army officer. Like I was immersed into the illusion of authority. I
Yeah.
was participating actively in the illusion of authority. I was an agent of the state, you could say, right?
Yeah.
And imagine the cognitive dissonance that it required for me. Dude, I was just thinking about this the other day. In 2016, right when I commissioned as an officer in the Army, I've said this before. I was definitely more left leaning, and I remember I was at basic officer leader course in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for field artillery, and we were studying like for some field artillery exams, and we were at one of my friend's house watching like the election results come in, and I was so pissed that Donald Trump was winning, and like I wasn't a Hillary fan by any means, but I was definitely more left leaning. I was like, I cannot stand to see this motherfucker be put in office. No way, blah, 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 blah. So imagine that man now saying that authority itself is an illusion. Of course, Hillary and her husband are beyond corrupt. I would argue that Donald Trump is as well. But the point is that, like, imagine the undoing that was required there. So when you say that I'm just confirming my own bias,
I know.
I laugh because it's like, you have no idea where I was like if just a few years ago, right?
I know. I've had that levied against me as well. I'm a folk singer, so like, Woody Guthrie is a hero and mentor of mine. And a friend sort of said, "Well, you wear that 'This Machine Kills Fascists' hoodie, so that just means everything you look at through the lens of trying to kill fascists." It's like,
Oh my
well,
God.
yeah, I mean, yes, and there's a lot of them to see through this lens,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah, yeah.
And my wife reminds me that when we first met, I had "The system is a fraud" bumper sticker on my old Volvo. And it's funny because back then that just sort of seemed like a punky thing to say and to put on your car. But I was a kid, right? I was
Yeah.
22 years old. I didn't really know what it meant to call out the system as a fraud. It
Hmm.
just but I always had that intuition that things weren't quite right, and boy, are we living against the grain, and people do seem to be really unhealthy, and why is there always a war? And like, I was hot on
Yeah.
the trail on knowing that there was something very wrong, but I didn't actually know. I had to grow up around that principle and like
Yeah.
actually be articulate about what that means as a man, as a grown-up man, and
Yeah.
not just as like a punky kid who wants to like fly a flag but not actually live his life in accordance to pushing back against that reality.
I can think of two examples on both sides. So many of my West Point friends, or let's just say Army officers that I like when I was in the Army, you'd see so many people fly the "Don't Tread on Me" flag or have it as a sticker on the back of their car. I'm like, do you really know what that actually means? Like, do you really get what that means? Because the ideals that you are, quote, fighting for by being an officer in the Army are completely at odds with the "Don't Tread on Me" ideals. It's complete opposite. It's essentially an anti-state flag, for lack of a better term. And then on the flip side, on the more left-leaning side of things, um, the people who love Rage Against the Machine, and I do love Rage Against the Machine, their music, but then they play at a Vax only concert like a year ago. Like, what the hell? It's not Rage Against the Machine anymore. It's Rage on Behalf of the Machine. That's what we should call them now. But it's
Yeah,
just funny. Yeah.
we have a this is a complete aside, but on our the very first Mammals album, there's an instrumental that we called "Rage Against the Ice Machine," and for some reason, like, I think we had it back then that we were seeing through their bullshit. Even then, it's like, yeah, they're just raging again. They're just like some drunk dudes in a hotel lobby at
Yeah.
2 a.m. trying to get ice out of the machine for their beer.
Yeah, they're raging against literal, like, actual, like, machines, like vending machines and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alec, to what degree is this like sort of mass abdication of self-governance a symptom of like forgetting our own inner divinity? And to what extent is the reclamation of self-governments and the success of something like voluntarism dependent on us like rediscovering that inner divinity?
I think that the two are inextricably linked. Like, I think that dissolving the conditioned belief surrounding the authority of men and women requires that you go inward and connect with that divinity, that inherent connection to God that all of us have. And that's not a religious thing. It's so beyond like dogmatic religion. And it's, if that looks like Christianity for you, that's totally fine. If it looks like Judaism, Islam, that's all fine. But it's connecting with this thing, this thing that is almost indescribable, you can't put into words, that is there, that is beyond yourself, that sort of begins to ironically make sense of all of this stuff. Like, it makes sense of it despite an inability to describe what it is, right? And I think the pursuit of that, as you're dissolving all the untruths, and I think we'll never be able to fully attain the knowledge of what it is, right, while we're in this life, but the pursuit of it leads you to an understanding that there's that all is well, all is as it should be, and that we're fully okay. And when you rest on that, and you rest on the understanding that we are eternal, all of this manipulation, all of this coercion, the propaganda, you don't fall for it as much because you know who you are. You know that that most of this stuff is rooted in the fear of death at some level.
Mm.
It's rooted in the fear of death. That's what they wield against us, fear of death of ourselves or our family members. But when you get to an understanding that you know, like you know, like you know, although you can't prove it, that we are eternal beings, that there's something greater than us, that there's something greater at play with all of this, it sort of takes the weight off of it. It brings the weight off your shoulders, and it's less heavy. And I shared on Luke Story's podcast this, I believe that at a fundamental level we are all one, but ironically, almost like a paradox, despite being all one, we are immersed in a reality of separation, and it's a very real separation. You could say it's an illusion, and I do say that, right? But it's real. Like, we are all three separate men talking to each other right now, right? But at some fundamental level, we are all one. And it's flowing in sort of a dance between those two understandings. Like, that's why for me, meditation and prayer first thing in the morning and qigong is so important, because it brings me back to that understanding of oneness. It brings me back to my connection with God the Creator. It sort of sets the tone for the rest of my day, so that when I go back into the reality that we're in of separation, I have that in the back of my mind and on my heart as I navigate through this reality, and it becomes less heavy. And I think that if we were all doing that, we would understand how voluntaryism and what Charles Eisenstein talks about as interbeing, although they appear to be mutually exclusive ideas, because one is talking about how it's all focused on the individual and the other is talking about how we're all interconnected, are not actually mutually exclusive. In fact, both are needed. It's understanding that we are all individuated portions of the whole that should never be pushed or coerced or manipulated or propagandized or threatened to do something that we do not want to do, so long as we are not infringing or imposing upon other people, but also recognizing that as these individuated portions, we also ironically need each other. We need community. We need connection. We're interdependent on each other. And I think both those things together would allow us to exist in a liberty-centric society where people are freely giving, because they're not coerced or manipulated to give their hard-earned money like the state does through taxation. So it's like, dang, there's abundance all around me. I will freely give this to help others, and it would lift other people out of poverty. And I know I went off on a tangent towards the end there. Didn't fully answer your question. Actually, I think I did, but yeah.
You did. No, you did. And there's something beautiful, the yin and yang of those opposites working together and in harmony. And it can be difficult for a person to wrap your mind around reconciling what appear to be polar opposites, and yet that this exists everywhere all around us. This notion of polar opposites and yin and yang, and the balance of opposing forces. Let's switch gears real quick, because I know we're coming up on the end of your time. Let's come back to the end of COVID. Why should the listener tune in to the end of COVID, and what should they expect when they do?
Yeah. So for this audience, I would say you should tune in to the end of COVID, because I think even if your understanding of terrain and the lack of proof of viruses, et cetera, we go even deeper than that, and we contextualize things like what really is going on with these gain of function experiments. We go into that in a deep way. What is going on with measles, chickenpox, polio? What's really happening with those so-called diseases then, if it's not caused by an infectious virus? We go into that in a deep way. We go into all the things we've discussed for the majority of this podcast regarding the illusion of authority in a very, very deep way. We go into, for the last half of the end of COVID, solutions not only with respect to freedom, but also solutions with respect to health in a post germ nonsense paradigm, what health might look like. And those last two modules are called A New Health Story, where we explore a number of things, sort of contextualizing and creating a framework for a loose framework for what health might look like after we dissolve this conditioned belief surrounding boogeyman particles, right? And in addition to that, I think it goes without saying, in order to prevent this nonsense from happening again, we all need to be fully informed. So this is a course. Like, let's just call it what it is. It's like a course. It's 90 recorded presentations, interviews, roundtable discussions, and a few full-length documentaries inside of it, discussing every single thing that happened the last 3.5 years and beyond, so that we can be fully informed and we can ensure this nonsense doesn't happen again. So maybe if you feel you already know all that stuff, great. Then please, please, please share it with other people, because the more people we can get to understand this stuff, the more things like what Bill Gates is calling 2025 don't happen, or what the New York Post just posted the other day, that the World Health Organization says the next pandemic is coming and it's going to be more deadly than COVID. That doesn't happen. We don't fall for the BS anymore, and especially not the gain of function BS, when we're fully informed on all the things that happened with this whole charade.
And Alec, where and when can we tune in?
Yeah, so our launch is on June 20th, and you can tune in at theendofcovid.com. I recommend clicking the link I would assume will be in this episode that you guys have, probably in the show notes. But it begins on June 20th, and we'll trickle out a few different sessions each day over the course of 22 days. So, yeah.
And Alec, last time we had you on, about a year ago, actually, we asked you about your non-negotiables and those daily habits you do to tend to your terrain. My follow-up question is, in this past year, what new sort of habit have you integrated into your life?
Yeah, a few times a week boxing. Because I found that so I grew up with a lot of rage. Like my dad was pretty physical with me, right? And like my dad and I have the best relationship we've ever had. So I don't hold any of that against him. And that's, forgiveness. He's made amends, et cetera, et cetera. But what I found is that because I was growing up, I was expressing my own rage. Like, I would get in a lot of fist fights with people. I would get in fist fights with my older brother. I would get in fist fights, with my own dad. I would get in fist fights at bars when I was in college all the time. And it's because I would reach a boiling point of suppressing my anger, and then it would express, right? Usually imposing or infringing upon someone else, which is not healthy. And then so what I've done is I've gone the opposite end of that over the last few years and stuffed all of the emotions down. It's just like, just breathe through it. And I'm like expressing it, and I'll cry quite a bit. But not fully expressing that, like, that anger that's inside of me sometimes. And so I've sort of come back to, well, I need to be punching things. Like, that's a good release for me, just not other people. So I've started boxing a lot more again. Yeah. So that's what I do.
Do you print out a photo of anyone that you put on?
I've had so many people say that. No, but sometimes I'll imagine someone there. Yeah.
All right. We don't need to ask who. We don't need to ask who.
Sometimes I will imagine someone's there. Yeah.
Love it. Well, all right, listener. End of COVID. Make sure you tune in. Alec Zeck, as always, man. Thank you for taking the time. We know you're busy. Get back to that end of COVID production, and man, we look forward to future conversations with you down the road. Thanks for joining us on Terrain Theory.
Mike, Ben, you guys are awesome. Much love.
Much love.
Dr. Miranda, dear listener, welcome to the after party in the Pineal Room. Mike, I saw you, like, you're shuffling a notebook over there. So I'm taking, this is classic. I take notes on my computer as the guest is talking, and you're writing it down, aren't you? You got that like pen. It's classic analog Dr. Miranda.
There it is. I'm a voluntaryist. It's funny. There's a t-shirt right there. Alex should make that shirt.
I know. Yeah. It's a conversation. So this comes back to that fire hose thing. Yeah. And also perhaps like the slowness with which I am assimilating new information into my life, and the voluntarist conversation and topic I'm I've been fully aware of, I think, since he started talking about it. And it's just that thing that's like, I know I'm going to get there.
Yeah.
And I'm going to dive into this so I can assimilate it. I can speak intelligently on it, and it resonates. But I
Yeah.
haven't like bought the books yet. I haven't
Yeah.
jumped into that because I'm still sort of, I don't know. I feel something that we talked about after hanging up is that this ongoing conversation around COVID, this ongoing conversation around there are no viruses, and plenty of people who are listening are like, yeah, we understand that. Like, let's, what's the next thing? But there are so many people out there who still have no idea what terrain means, like no idea what terrain theory or terrain model, any of that means. So you come back to it, it's like we're gonna sit on this for a little bit, or like this is the stepping stone,
Yeah.
come and join and like take the stepping stone, and then you move on to voluntarism. But this is this still remains my focus.
Yeah. I think
But
that's very wise. And I think this is the moment. Like people, I think the nerve is less raw right now. People aren't as triggered by the whole mask conversation or the social distancing and the finger pointing and the judgment. That's still close enough in our rearview mirror that I think this is a moment where you can speak to people or maybe get their attention to consider some new information because we're close enough that it's still relevant to how they're living their lives.
yeah, I think so. I think you're right. And because we're not living in that heightened state of fear.
Right.
We've been okay, so I say we, but I'm talking about the masses.
Yeah, the culture as a
The,
whole.
the
Yeah.
the people have been told that COVID is over. WHO has said COVID is over. Joe Biden has said COVID is over. So people can take that breath and be like, I'm not going to die immediately. And now you do the postmortem. You do the
Yeah.
debrief. You do the
Yeah.
reflection and be like, okay, my life, I've run away from the tiger, and now we're back
Yes.
in the around the fire, and we're like, what just happened? And
Yeah.
so in some regard, like, this is a good time for it, particularly because, as Alex said, you've got Bill Gates talking about 2025. You have the New York. This is something that was happening even while we were still, quote unquote, in within COVID, is the next pandemic. Already this rhetoric around the next one's coming and it's going to be worse.
Yeah.
So we've got this little pause, this little breath for the masses. So it is a good time to go, wait a minute, what just happened? And we're lucky, when AIDS happened, we didn't have the internet. It's
Right.
incredible when you start to
Right.
think about the things that are being the things that are being discussed right now. Looking at history, lost history, old world, things that we talked about with Matt Roski, electroculture, things that existed only in these books that were impossible to find, that weren't in your library,
Yeah.
in your school, or in your local library. Thing, even events that happened at a time when the internet didn't exist. And I don't think anyone could anticipate something like the internet existing. And now, all these topics, everything, people talking about these topics, it's right there.
Yeah.
And it's instantaneous, and it's connecting people at the speed of light. And it's incredible. And you, man, I keep thinking how fragile the whole thing is, and
Yeah.
how kind of easy, like how easily the plug could get pulled, and then all of a sudden we're disconnected again, and all this knowledge that we're accruing and sharing across the ether, across the ethernet, is just lost. Like, all of a sudden you can't access it anymore, like that reset and our ability
Yeah.
to connect.
Yeah, I mean that is a real specter. But at some level, the cat's out of the bag. It's like I think enough people
Y-
have seen enough,
yeah.
and have learned discernment too, to not just like, accept everything they see as this must be what's real. Someone I was listening to, I think his name's Robert Edward Grant yesterday. He's this like deep mathematical geometric mind, and he recontextualized the speed of light as the speed of perception,
Mm.
which which I really enjoyed. But much like I contextualized this awareness of like sort of ether studies and electroculture as just a broadening of the understanding of permaculture, of ecological design sciences, I feel like this conversation around voluntarism is just the study of finding those bars of the cage, right? And like the science and the study and the practice of extricating yourself from the cage. And so that's sort of the
Mm.
lens I'm approaching it with. It's putting our Quinian philosophy to the test and like actually figuring out what it practically means to extricate yourself from the bars of the cage.
In some ways, it's answering the question that Daniel himself posed in Beyond Civilization, or the question that his
Yes.
students posed to him,
Yes.
which was, okay, what is that? What is that way to live? What
He
is
didn't know.
beyond? He didn't
Yeah.
know, and as he said, we didn't know. It would look as foreign to us as the Renaissance looked to those who preceded it, like
Correct.
as crazy and futuristic. And voluntarism, that's what I think I enjoy so much about it, is it's okay, maybe this is the way. And I also love Alec's clarification that I don't have the answer. We're charting,
Yeah.
we're charting the way forward. We don't know where we're going to get to. We don't 100% have that vision fleshed out, but this feels like a good path. So voluntarism is as good as any system that I've encountered, as an alternative to the one we're in.
I agree. And for the listener who's never heard that word before, which I hadn't before a few months ago, it's essentially synonymous with anarchism. And anarchy has a stank on it, and people picture, you know, fires in the streets and people in masks, breaking windows and stuff. That's sort of like this like dystopian punk imagery of anarchy. But what it means, as I understand it, is like monarchy means one ruler. Anarchy means no ruler. Just it doesn't mean no rules. There are still mutually agreed upon, uh, ways to live in communion with each other, but it does mean no rulers, that no one can rule over you. And I think that's an important clarification.
So then, Michael, this begs the question, where did that perception of anarchy come from? How was that seeded in our brains? And who did that?
What's interesting, and I think this is what you're driving at. I feel like the the punk rock movement is where that was seeded,
That's where I come back to as well.
right?
And so where did they get it? And
Like
who
like
started
Sex
it?
Pistols, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You know where I'm going.
I
Boy
do it.
bands, the boy bands, the boy
And
punk. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this concept that actually is a competitor to the current civilizational system, and we're going to give it this really scary spin, and we're going to
ooh,
associate it with,
right
punk rockers who smash hotel rooms and don't live by any rules at all.
there it is.
Huh. Well, there
Damn,
you go, listener. There's another rabbit hole for someone to go down.
this is the type of shit that Crow 777 gets into.
Right.
Yep,
Yeah.
is I guess the what do we even call it? Just that the mind control, the that nothing is as it seems. Nothing that
Mm,
gets big and very popular happens, I would say, organically, as
yeah.
we're led to believe. Like, oh, some guys in a basement start a band and they're really good and they have fans and listeners, and now they're a household name. Like, I think that's what we're beginning to see through, is that you don't really become a household name without the guys around a table in a dark room smoking cigars, like sort of pull the puppet master.
Moving the chess pieces around.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's true of fucking Sid Vicious. I
Yeah.
think that's the insinuation. And when you start to put the pieces together like you just did, it really does add up. I mean, someone Crow made this observation that what was the name of the most famous Sex Pistols record?
Oh, I can't remember.
Never mind the Bullocks,
Oh,
right?
never mind the bullet. Yeah, yeah.
Here come the Sex Pistols.
Here come the Sex
What was the
Pistols.
most popular album in the late 90s when we were teenagers?
Never mind.
Never mind.
Yeah.
It's the same word.
Same word.
It's almost like this.
That's bizarre, right?
And what was the message of Nirvana? Basically,
It's like
apathy.
apathy. Apathy.
Yeah, everything's fucked.
Angst, like angst and apathy.
Yep,
And then what did he supposedly do, allegedly do? Just took his own life.
as we're told.
Yeah,
The
as we're told.
narrative.
Yeah.
That's the narrative. So,
Yeah.
There's a lot of, it's funny, Ben, we were, I think, raised with almost those kindergarten principles of like, or maybe not kindergarten. Kindergarten's more like be nice to people and like tie your shoes. But like, okay, elementary school, young education is like, what were some of the basic like cookie cutter principles? Never be afraid to ask questions.
Mm,
Be brave,
mm,
be courageous and brave and overcome fear. And when you actually do that as an adult in the land of the free, home of the brave, and you start asking questions, you are a liability
yeah.
to normalcy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
You're
so
called.
that's what's,
Yeah.
I feel like freedom and bravery have been canceled in the land of the free, home of the brave.
Upside down world.
Upside down world. Yeah.
Upside down world.
So it does feel good, even though, stepping outside of, uh, as Alex so beautifully articulates, stepping outside of the iron grip the state seems to have over our psyches, there is something to embracing the principles of, or like to walk in the truth of freedom and bravery and free thought, free expression, and the power of free assembly. All these words on a page that we were actually taught, but to embody them is a real deal uh, phenomenon. It's not a small thing.
Well, I think that you kind of hit on it. Is we've been conditioned to believe that our freedoms come from a piece of paper, that
Right.
rights are guaranteed us by a constitution or a piece of paper written up by people hundreds of years ago. And this notion of voluntaryism and like true sovereignty speaks to something else. I think that's as far as I'm going to go, because I don't like talking about it, because I know it is such an important topic.
Yeah.
And I think probably the fundamental topic, the foundational topic, that I I I know I need to be way better versed before I start to open my mouth about it. So I'm more like, I'm just going to ask questions and listen right now, and then make
Yeah.
sure that I have that time to devote to really understanding it before we go there. Because as Alex said, it is inextricably linked, isn't it? It's so linked to this notion of medical freedom, health freedom. Well, then we come back to, what's the definition of things? Well, what is freedom?
Yeah.
So really, that's what he's getting to, and that's the heart of things. That's just the heart of it, and the definition of the most important word. What is freedom? So
What is
yeah,
freedom? And also, you were just saying, we're taught that freedom is words on a page, on a dusty page written, a couple hundred years ago. And that's always a message that we get. Our forefathers fought for our freedom. What about our current fathers? What about now? Who's fighting now? Because we're
mm,
always taught to hearken back to what happened before and to stand up in their name and in their honor, but we're not really encouraged to actually walk in their footsteps.
no, it's the opposite. We're discouraged from that.
Yeah,
We're
that's
discouraged from doing so.
yeah.
It's hard for you and I. I'm going to say it's hard for you. I'm just going to speak for you. It
Do
must
it.
be hard for you. You probably lose a lot of sleep over this. Uh, Trying to recall something that happened, 250 years ago, and then go, well, did it really ever happen? I know you're questioning everything,
Sure.
so we have to question everything. What
Yeah.
was that? Where did the Constitution come from? Who were the forefathers? What was really going on back there? What was the purpose of the creation of America?
Yeah.
The whole notion of Washington D.C.,
Yep.
London,
Yep.
and the Vatican. I mean, now we're just okay. Now we're spiraling, aren't we?
No, we're not. I think you're right on topic.
We've like horizontal tunneled to a different rabbit hole, but you know what I mean. But you know what I mean, right? Because people are doing this kind of this again. This comes back to like the connectivity of the internet, and how easy it is to get some of this information, and people having these conversations about what is Washington D.C., what is that connection between D.C. and London, and the Vatican, and who's really in charge, and what is a birth certificate, and what is a social security number, who owns you, the
Yep.
straw man, all that stuff. It's all like interconnected. We're
Yep.
just like this conversation around terrain and health is just one piece of this bigger puzzle. It's an important piece. Like, how often do people say like all you have is your health? Like this is it. This is your
Yeah.
body, this is your temple, this is all you have is your health.
Yeah.
But the ability to pursue health the way you want to is completely wrapped up in something like freedom and
I agree.
sovereignty. So
Before we hit record, I think we were talking about this, is that how I almost feel like we just stumbled into it. But if you're gonna unravel everything and really put everything under the microscope, what a beautiful lens to do it through. Health,
yeah.
right? Which, again, as we've said ad nauseum, we're not trained in this. I feel like actually at this point we've gleaned some pretty powerful training
I,
through these conversations, but not in any sort of formal sense, right? But to disentangle or to untangle the entire world, the culture, the history, as we've been told, through the lens of health is just so elegant and powerful and beautiful. It's not, I'm not doing it. I am, but I'm not doing it weekly via a talk show with music. I'm not doing it through the arts. I'm not doing it through the university system. I'm not doing it in any other way but through this consistent exploration of health. And I keep coming back to the Tom Cowan principle of you'll never truly be well if you don't know what's actually real. It will always be, there will always be a dissonance of untruth, you know, within you if you're harboring too much falsity, whether you put it there or not. And I think that's sort of where I've come to in the last year is I want the things in my mind, body, and soul to be there because I put them there, or that because they're true and they're real. And it's it's no small thing to take out the garbage.
I think that when you say we're not trained in this, use that as a disclaimer. We always say,
We always say that, I know.
I think it's actually a leg up because we don't have to like
Yes.
decondition ourselves. So it's a claimer. I'm not going to call it a disclaimer anymore. It's a claimer. This is a feather. This is this is our badge.
You are not wrong. You are not wrong. And I think we've probably mentioned Tommy John burning his
Yeah, yeah,
his
yeah.
diplomas on the beach. It's like
He's
that was a
on to something. He's on to
yeah.
something. I've got to decondition all of anyone in the allopathic system who's trying to have these conversations about health. You first have to decondition yourself before you can start having those conversations. Maybe. I don't know.
I no, I mean you do, Ben. And I love that Alex said the end of COVID sort of could have been called the end of allopathy. Like, whoa,
Yeah. Wow.
they're swinging for the fences. They're taking it all on,
Yeah.
and as we said, sort of now or never. But as you move through life and you interface with um obviously there's your inner circle who you see on a regular basis, there's friends and family, and then the circles sort of go out from there. But we've started doing more gigs again, thank God. And but as a result you're just interfacing with more people, or I am, right? And so you start hearing people's stories just in making small talk. you know um hey, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. You get to know the person a little bit better. Oh, I've got this, my son was just diagnosed with X. And just the self-talk, the stories people, I'm learning to sort of like decode um people's wellness. Not in a judgmental sense, but I'm paying attention to the words they use and the stories they believe
Mm.
as it relates to their health, their family's health. And again, not in a judgmental way or that like I know better, but it's very, very, very much born of the allopathic mindset, the victim mentality. It's out of their control. They're sick because I don't know why, but the doctor says I have this, and so I have to take this, or I have to go in for surgery, or I have to get this opinion. And it's all couched in that allopathic victim mentality where there's no agency, accountability, or an awareness. And, as someone who likes to be helpful, the gears are sort of always moving in the back of my head. Like, what's my way in with this person? Especially someone
Mm.
who's like a new friend that I don't even know that well. It's like, you don't want to come on too strong. You don't want to be judgmental. You don't want to freak them out, but
Yeah.
you do want to be of service, right?
You want to, well, yeah, you want to share with them who you are and where you are on your journey.
Yeah.
And they're bringing up a topic that you happen to have a lot of opinions on based on conversations you've had with other folks who have opinions on it and who've done a lot of work in this field now. So,
Yeah.
but to your point, to answer your question, like, what does that weigh in? We talk about this all the time. Like, what are the links? What are the podcast episodes I want to send
Yep.
to such and such a person who is going through this or this or this? And that's a great, it's just such a great question. And it's always dependent on that person. Where
Yep.
are they in their journey? How curious are they? I've decided it comes down to three things,
Mm.
three criteria. One, you've got to be curious.
Mm-hmm.
Two, you have to be open-minded. And those two things are different. You can be
Yes.
curious about something, but you don't have the open mind to actually like take in the new information. And then three, you've got to have the time.
Yeah.
So you got to be willing to invest the time. So if you don't have those three things, it's not going to be as fruitful a conversation, and it almost is going to be a waste. And it might even drive a wedge between us, me and whoever that person is. So
Yeah.
if I can determine those first three things, if you meet those three criteria, then okay, we can begin to have this conversation.
That's well said. I think you just boiled it down beautifully.
Well, and then on that note, I'm going to end this conversation on my
Yeah.
high point, Mike. Usually we end it on your high point because you have so many of them, and I can't find a high point.
Well, I love in that last call, and you're so gracious. Like, this was another one, like 40 minutes in. I'm just like sitting here chilling. It's like I don't need to talk to hear myself talk. You guys were bringing it. But thank you for pulling me in and making me find my way in, because I did appreciate that. And I love Alec so much. He brings so much to this world. And yeah, we should wrap this up because you have a meeting to get to with him.
I guess so.
Coming right up.
Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make this transparent too to the audience. You and I need like either a hand signal or a word that I say that is the cue for you to like jump in. So I don't know what that could be, like fruitcake or something. Like if I just, it's like a hand gesture. Maybe if I cover my eye with one hand. Oh no! What have I done? I've outed myself. Okay, that was silly and no. Okay, well, I've just provided fodder for someone. We'll figure that out. Listener, what we'll do is Mike and I will decide on this cue word for him to jump in, and then you can email us if you figured it out. We're not going to tell you what it is. We'll decide it offline, and that'll be a little mystery. And on that note,
now
listener,
someone's like, he just said cue.
Oh, yeah, there it is. Yeah. Oh no.
Sorry,
you can't get. You know what I mean? You can't win.
You can't win. Anyway, I keep derailing your off ramp. So
no, here's my off ramp. Nothing you heard here should be taken as medical advice because neither Mike nor I are medical experts, and you're welcome for that, listener. Remember that you are light, you are love, and you are your primary healthcare provider. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next one.